I mean, we think of science and scientists as this kind of rather homogenous group of people that do things in a certain kind of way. Yes, there are underlying principles, of course, and processes and whatever else. But science comes in many flavors, and exploration, and space exploration in particular, is something that most scientists would just simply run away from. It's considered very risky, and what I mean is it's not risky in terms of it's not deadly or dangerous, although it can be very stressful at times, I have to say. But it's very risky in career terms because literally you might spend a lot of time getting absolutely nowhere. So let's start with this picture here of the Earth. It's an absolutely beautiful place. That image has only been taken about 40-odd years ago, but I think we know and love the place. It's a very delicate, very beautiful, fragile place. Long may it remain so. But it wasn't always like that. This is what it would have looked like 4.5 billion years ago when the planet was actually forming. And geologists call this period the Hadean, after Hades. And you can imagine, you couldn't have any life on the surface of a planet like that. I mean, in a way, the Earth, as we know it now, is a bit of a misfit itself. I mean, it is the only planet we know currently anywhere in the solar system, in the galaxy or the universe that has life on it. But clearly at this point in time, it didn't have any life on it. And that's something that interests me. How do we go from one state to another and get ultimately to where we are today, a room full of people able to contemplate this very question? Now, obviously, we see what the Earth looks like now. We have some ideas about what it looked like in the past. It had to go from one state to another. Eventually, those impacts, those lumps of material that were raining down on the surface to build up the Earth, it had to die down and stop. And at that point, there became a solid surface, and there became the possibility for water being on the surface. And then you start to get an environment in which you could imagine life could actually begin. And the particular aspect of the Rosetta mission, which is to go and visit a comet, is to actually kind of address what role comets might have played in this process. Comets are actually remnants from that planetary system forming event. They are bits and pieces of material that never actually formed into a planet, and they are still there now. So by going and studying them today, you can literally look back in time at the kinds of materials that would have been raining down on the primitive Earth. This is your classic image of a comet, a sort of object that you see in the night sky with a very long tail. These are the largest things that you can see within the solar system. So that object there and its tail is tens or maybe even hundreds of millions of miles long. But in actual fact, the body that's producing that tail would easily fit within the ring road here in Aylesbury. It's relatively small. So, although you can study that tail, you can look at that tail, you can see it with your own eyes sometimes. What you want to know is what is actually producing it. And that's what we want to do, right up close to this object that is actually making all that tail. And it starts for me, in some ways, in 1986 when the Giotto space mission flew past Comet Halley, and this is a classic image from that. It's about the best image we got because the spacecraft simply went past it and took some images. But it was a tremendously successful mission, and at that point afterwards, the European Space Agency, which had run this mission, said, "Well, what are we going to do next for a mission?" And so was born Rosetta. And if you, the shape that's used here is actually the Rosetta Stone, which is an object of great significance in Egyptology because it was what was used ultimately to translate and decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. But if you look closely, if you can read underneath Rosetta there, it says Comet Nucleus Sample Return Mission. So what ESA was planning to do after Giotto was to travel to a comet this time, collect the sample, and bring it back. And so around this time, I was building instruments. This is in the lab in Cambridge. And we were building instruments specifically to be able to address subjects like this. This is a unique instrument. You couldn't buy one of these, oddly enough. It's hard to imagine that. But, if you wanted to do something interesting and difficult, you had to make it yourself. And so some really fascinating things there to look at. For the historians amongst you, you'll note the PDP-11 computer. I mean, for me, previously to this, the closest I'd come to a computer was through a teletype terminal and punch cards. All of a sudden, I had a dedicated computer in the laboratory that was just simply for one instrument. I mean, that still is an amazing thing for me. We eventually relocated to the Open University in Milton Keynes. And at that point, we got some much bigger and better labs, and we were able to build these instruments into the next phase. And what I show here is an instrument that still exists in the labs now, and you've got a man there for scale. And of course, what we do here is we're building these great big instruments. We're making them really chunky and resilient. We're running them off the national grid, so we never worry about power or any of these kinds of things. But they have very specific things that they're going to do. They analyze very, very small samples and whatever else. And so again, this was the ethos that was going into a Comet nucleus sample return mission. Now, what actually happened was a reality check in that, A, it was going to be technologically far too difficult, and it was financially impossible under the circumstances. So, well, okay, right, we can't bring samples back to the laboratory. Why don't you guys take your laboratory to the Comet instead? We'll just do a one-way mission, and you can take your lab up there. Remember what you've just seen. And so it's like, well, okay, let's have a think about that. And so this is actually my system diagram from, you can't see it very well, but it is actually dated. It's dated as March 1993. And you can see it's kind of a back of an envelope. It's a couple of sheets of A4 with some drawings on there about how we would attempt to do this. And I worked on this very hard for a whole year, and then came up with another one. And I mean, this is the equivalent of making toast. I mean, what this shows you here is how to take an instrument to a comet and get it to measure stuff on the surface. It's exactly the same process that we go through. And as I say, that's 1994, and I'm always amazed when I look at it and think, actually, that's ultimately what we actually built. And there it is. It's an instrument about the size of a shoebox, and you can see a small bit of a hand there for scale. So we've taken that instrument that filled a room and shrunk it down into something that's small enough to actually fit on top of a rocket. I mean, you can't take great lumps of ironwork into space. So that was an incredibly challenging thing to do. And the instrument, for those of you who can read Egyptian hieroglyphics, is actually called Ptolemy. And that cartouche there, which says Ptolemy, was one of the key things that was instrumental in deciphering hieroglyphics. Now, at this point, I want to just say what I'm going to talk about is the scientific view of evolution and the creation of the universe and so on. And I just remind myself that, this is a page of creation myths or creation stories from Wikipedia. And I'm absolutely fascinated by these things personally. I learnt them in a certain way because of my upbringing. But I'm really respectful for creation stories. They're fascinating in their own right. But what I study is the scientific worldview. And here's a poster that we put together several years ago for Stargazing Live. And what it shows going across here is time from the beginning to ultimately where we are now. And actually, it's interesting. There's an error on this poster that we did. We said the universe was 13.7 billion years old. Actually, we now know it's 13.8 billion years old. And I think that what that shows is that science is not something that's cast in stone forever. It is constantly changing and evolving in response to new data and new information. So it's a great example of that. So here's the poster in a different light. And what this shows you is that at some point, there was nothing. And then there was something called the Big Bang, and then there was something. And something evolved over many billions of years until at some point we formed the Earth, which, as I say, was about 4.5 billion years ago. And at some point, at some fuzzy point around that time, after 4.5 billion years, life got started. And I'm particularly interested in how you went from one thing to another. Okay, so what is life? We kind of know it when we see it, really, don't we? It's the state of being alive. These are dictionary definitions, by the way. It's the sum of activities of plants and animals. It's the period between birth and death. Actually, if you go to a good old Open University textbook, you'll find a nice succinct definition of what life is. Living organisms are defined as those that have the attributes of reproduction, growth, and metabolism. So that's what we mean by life in a dry kind of scientific sense. Now, this is something called the phylogenetic tree of life. And so basically, it's based on genetics. And what you find if you measure samples of the genetics of all living things on Earth, they actually can all be related through this one tree. That's quite a remarkable thing. And it has these three main parts to it. So we're up here, look, animals, just next to slime molds and fungi. And there's all of these things, all the things on Earth that you can think of, all come back to one last universal common ancestor. So that looks to be how it happened once life got started. So what I'm going to do now is I've turned that tree on its side, and I'm going to run time from left to right. And so there must have been some things going in to the bottom of that tree that were somehow contributing to that point which started off from the last universal common ancestor. So this was stuff that was coming out of stars, elements that were being created in stars. When planetary systems like our own solar system formed, those elements were getting changed into different kinds of elements through processes that were happening there. And in particular, this part of the story is, comets were bringing ices and so on into the solar system, and they were contributing to the bottom of this tree as well. So I now see this as the roots of this tree, all these different pathways into it. And comets is just one part of that system that we're interested in exploring there. What did comets bring to that point? Can we see some material there that existed in the moment before life was created? And so to Rosetta. As I say, it's not a sample return mission. It's a rendezvous and landing mission. So it has two parts. It has an orbiter, which is currently in orbit around the comet, and this lander known as Philae, which was put down on the surface last year. And it's interesting. I love the fact that it's been a high-profile project and it's been managed very well by the PR people, I think. And it's now starting to generate these science-art crossovers. So this is a lovely painting of the target object. It's just inspiring people in different ways. It's tremendous. And this is our lander called Philae, and we say it's the size of a washing machine. So that's the kind of size that lander is. And what we did when we designed it and put it together, we said, and I love this, the way this is described in this news article, as a Swiss Army knife of scientific instruments. I mean, that's what we did. We said, you got one shot of doing this, probably in a lifetime. So what is it you would want to take with you to a comet? And it's just everything you can possibly cram into the lander. So there are 10 instruments on there, of which ours is one. Now, that's very complicated. That is the real system diagram. But what it shows is a few key parts of it. So down at the bottom here is an oven. It's a little device about this big, and you put stuff in it, and you heat it up. And that then takes the cometary materials, converts it into gases, and puts it into this system. There are various parts, it's far too complicated to go into, but there is one section here that are basically some very, very long and thin, narrow pipes. And these act to separate multi-component gases into their components. And finally, at the end of it all, it goes into a device called a mass spectrometer. And that's the thing that actually tells us what the components are. And this is the actual mass spectrometer that we made. That would actually sit on the palm of your hand, weighs a couple of 100 grams in total. And the cylindrical structure that you can see there is about the size of a cotton reel. So that's what you need to do if you want to send a mass spectrometer into space. It was a bit of a turkey to build. The engineers didn't like having all these wires to have to deal with, but they managed quite successfully. And there's just some images of the completed flight model. We were doing this in about the late 1990s, 2000s. And I love the image up here, yeah, a black box, because that's what it is at the end of the day. It's got a nice cover on it. And there is the black box being integrated onto Philae. This is actually Philae. This is actually the lander when it was just two pieces of metal, and we were the first instrument that was integrated onto it. Now, if anybody's thinking of going into this business, don't do that. It's wrong, because you have to be there before everyone else. June 2001, we were doing that. After a launch delay and a few other problems, we finally launched into space in March 2004. I then sat at my desk with my feet up for 10 years until January last year. And if you can remember the wake-up event, it was on about 6 o'clock, so it was great for the tea time news. And this is what we were actually looking for, this spike on this trace. Actually, what actually happened is that we didn't get it at the time we were supposed to because the onboard computers crashed and had to reboot. Can you imagine? And so we were like 30 minutes late. That was pretty nerve-wracking, I can tell you. We started to get images of the comet shortly afterwards, and although you can't see much in this, what actually happened is the comet started to develop a tail far earlier than it should have done. This was the first clue that things weren't going according to the script. This was the next one. All those thoughts of this being some kind of spherical potato-shaped object were put into disarray when we found out, oh no, it actually looks like a rubber duck. And there is the absolute iconic image of the comet, a very complicated thing that we got in about August last year. In November, we sent Philae, the lander, down to the surface. And lovely clips from an ESA cartoon. It landed, sent us signal back, it touched down, all the champagne corks went, lots of dancing, people having a great time. But actually in the back room, where some of us were working, what had actually happened is it hadn't anchored itself to the surface. The harpoons hadn't fired, and it had gone back off into space. It tumbled around a bit for a couple of hours, and it eventually landed on the surface. And it's currently sitting there now in hibernation. So in actual fact, we actually landed twice. Three times. It's actually far more than the design spec. And this is just a picture from the actual day of the landing. And without going into it, at the first point we touched down and lifted back off, 9 minutes after that, we switched our instrument on and sniffed to see what we could smell. And there it is. Okay, it's an Excel graph, isn't it? But to me, it's pure poetry. This is what we worked for 20-odd years for. It's a plot of the mass versus the abundances. And what I'd like you to take away from it, I can't tell you what it is because it'd be really, really boring, but look at the regularity in it. This is telling us about something really, really important about what is at the surface of the comet. Well, there is the comet. It's getting active. And these are some recent images. And if I just flick them backwards and forwards, you can see they were taken a couple of minutes apart. It's starting to get active. It's just exactly what we wanted. And that's the view from, I'll say underneath. The lander is currently on its side, but we can see the surface. It's right there. And if you all keep your fingers crossed and we wake up, we'll be drilling into it and making some more measurements later in the year. Thank you very much.